Sophia's body was a dull ache, every muscle screaming in protest as she sank onto the plush couch in the CEO's apartment, the weight of exhaustion pulling her down like a heavy blanket. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant city noises creeping through the window. She had worked a double shift at the diner, cleaned a neighboring office building, and then rushed to finish a few hours of housekeeping at the luxurious apartment, all within the span of a single, grueling day. The weight of it all pressed heavily on her, but it was the weight of her family's survival that kept her going. Sophia was only 23, but she already felt like she had lived 1,000 lifetimes, each one defined by struggle, by sacrifice, and by the desperate need to provide. Her mother, ill for years, depended on Sophia for everything, and her younger brother, only a teenager, was on the verge of falling into the wrong crowd. Sophia had taken on more work than most could ever endure, all while trying to keep up with her responsibilities at home. Yet, no matter how hard she worked, it never seemed like enough. There was always another bill, another expense, another thing to fix or buy or save for. The weight of her life hung over her like a cloud, and the hours she spent working in other people's worlds of luxury and privilege that felt as distant to her as the moon left her feeling like a ghost, unseen and unimportant. But tonight, in this moment, she wasn't thinking about the bills or the long hours ahead. She wasn't thinking about the never-ending cycle of work, sleep, and work again. She was simply too tired. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, and allowed herself to rest on the couch in the apartment she had been cleaning for weeks. It wasn't the most comfortable place. There was a slight creak in the cushions, the faint scent of fresh linens mingling with the faint smell of perfume left behind by the CEO, the man who owned this vast world of luxury. He was out of town, leaving her with the rare, fleeting chance to sit still. As she exhaled deeply, the tension in her body began to release, if only for a few minutes. It was the first time in days she hadn't felt the constant buzzing in her mind about the bills to pay, the doctors to call, the groceries to buy. For just this moment, there were no expectations of her, no deadlines to meet, no one to disappoint. She felt the coolness of the couch beneath her and the softness of the throw blanket she had hastily draped over her. She sank into it, her face turned toward the armrest, her eyes fluttering closed as the exhaustion finally took over. Sophia's life was a series of compromises. She had sacrificed her social life, her dreams, and even her health for the sake of those she loved. She had once dreamed of becoming a nurse, of helping others in a way that went beyond just cleaning their homes or serving their food, but those dreams had slowly faded away as life pressed in. She had set them aside, put them on a shelf she had learned to forget about. Every time she looked at the people she worked for, successful, wealthy, with all the things she couldn't have, she felt a deep pang in her chest. They didn't know the cost of their comforts, didn't know what it was like to spend hours scrubbing floors to make sure their apartments were spotless. They didn't know what it was like to miss meals just so your family could eat. But tonight, in the silence of the CEO's apartment, none of that mattered. For a brief, precious moment, Sophia didn't have to be anyone else. She didn't have to be the caregiver, the provider, or the exhausted daughter and sister. She could just be a woman, resting like a person who wasn't burdened by the weight of the world. The exhaustion that had consumed her slowly ebbed away, her breathing becoming steady and calm as she drifted into a sleep that was more like a pause, a brief interlude in the symphony of her chaotic life. It wasn't much, this brief escape, but in that fleeting silence, she felt a small flicker of peace, a quiet relief that she had long forgotten. Her body relaxed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, her mind was not racing. She was allowed this small moment to close her eyes and just exist. The world outside would still be there when she woke up: her mother's needs, her brother's struggles, the constant balancing act of her life. But for now, they could wait. In that rare moment of respite, she wasn't the exhausted maid, the tired daughter, or the burdened woman holding everything together. She was simply someone who had been allowed, for the briefest of seconds, to rest. As the minutes ticked by and the warmth of the blanket cocooned her, Sophia slept soundly, unaware of the fact that such small moments of peace, as fleeting as they were what allowed her to keep going. When she awoke, she would return to her duties, to her life, to the world she had built with sweat and sacrifice. But for now, she was allowed to dream of a world where rest wasn't a luxury, where being seen, being cared for, and being at peace didn't feel so impossible. For now, she could sleep. Richard had always prided himself on being a no-nonsense CEO, a man of results and high expectations, yet as he stepped into his office early one morning, the sight that greeted him was far from the polished, professional image he was accustomed to. There, on the couch in his sleek, glass-walled office, lay Sophia, one of his most diligent employees, her body curled up in an exhausted sleep. Her clothes were disheveled, her face pale from hours of strain, and the paperwork scattered around her told the story of someone who had been working tirelessly for far too long. Richard had been aware of her dedication, how she often stayed late, how her bright eyes and quick thinking had made her indispensable to the company, but seeing her like this, so vulnerable, so clearly overwhelmed, struck a chord deep within him. The scene was a sharp contrast to the image of corporate ambition he had built his life around. He had always believed in the value of hard work, but he had never truly understood the toll it took on people like Sophia. His instinct was to leave her be, to let her wake up on her own and continue with her day, as he had done for countless other employees who had burned the midnight oil. But something in him, something human and soft, stopped him. He could have easily ignored it, dismissed her as just another overworked employee, but as he stood there, watching her rest, the exhaustion on her face spoke volumes. It wasn't just physical tiredness, it was the weariness of someone who had given everything, someone who had no space left for herself. Richard, the wealthy CEO who had built his empire on grit and ruthless efficiency, was suddenly struck with an overwhelming sense of compassion. In that moment, he saw not just Sophia the employee, but Sophia the person, the woman who had sacrificed so much for a job that demanded more than it could ever give back. With a quiet decision, Richard stepped away from his desk, his mind shifting from business strategies and profit margins to something far more personal. He walked into the kitchen area of his office suite, a space that rarely saw action outside of high-powered meetings, and began to prepare breakfast. It wasn't an elaborate meal, just eggs, toast, and fresh orange juice, but the act of making something with his own hands, of offering a simple gesture of care, felt strange yet right. Richard wasn't someone who cooked, he had people for that. But as he cracked the eggs and flipped them carefully, his thoughts lingered on Sophia. He thought about the late nights she had spent at the office, the endless projects she had poured her heart into, the way she always put the company first, even at the expense of her own well-being. He didn't know if she had anyone at home to take care of her, if she had a support system that saw her beyond the roles she played at work. But in that moment, he wanted to offer her something real, something that acknowledged her humanity. As he plated the food and set the table with quiet care, Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of vulnerability that he rarely allowed himself to experience. Here he was, a CEO who had built a fortune from nothing, standing in his own kitchen, preparing breakfast for someone else, not because he had to, but because he felt it was the right thing to do. When the meal was ready, Richard returned to the couch where Sophia still lay, her breathing steady but heavy. He stood there for a moment, watching her, uncertain of how to wake her without startling her. He gently placed the plate of food on the coffee table in front of her, along with a steaming cup of coffee. It wasn't much, but it was something he hoped would convey the care he felt for her, something that might give her a small moment of respite from the relentless pace of the world she lived in. As the aroma of the food filled the room, Sophia began to stir, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked in confusion for a moment, her gaze landing on the breakfast before her. It took her a second to process the scene, Richard, standing by, watching her with an unreadable expression, and the simple meal in front of her, something she had never expected from someone like him. She looked up at him, unsure whether to feel embarrassed or grateful, but Richard only smiled softly, a rare, gentle expression on his usually composed face. "You've been working too hard, Sophia," he said quietly, his voice not the commanding tone of a CEO, but the caring tone of someone who recognized the exhaustion in her. "I thought you might need a break." The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. Sophia blinked again, unsure of how to respond, her exhaustion still evident in the way she held herself, but she nodded silently. For a brief moment, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the meal in front of her. It was the warmth of being seen, of being acknowledged beyond the role she played in the company. She didn't say anything, but the gratitude in her eyes spoke volumes. Richard, for all his wealth and status, had given her something far more valuable than any paycheck. He had given her kindness, and in that moment, it was the most powerful thing he could offer. As Sophia began to eat, her movements slower now, as though savoring both the food and the unexpected gesture of care, Richard turned away, returning to his office with a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had done something simple, something small, but it had shifted something within him. And for Sophia, it was a reminder that even in the high-stakes world they both occupied, moments of human connection could still exist, moments that could change the course of a day, or perhaps even a life. Richard quietly moved through the kitchen, the soft sound of his footsteps barely audible on the old wood floors. The sun had barely risen, and the light filtered gently through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. His eyes briefly flickered toward Sophia, still deep in slumber on the couch, the weariness of her day etched into the delicate lines of her face. She had worked late the night before, as she often did, giving everything she had to her job, always pushing herself harder than anyone expected, always putting others first. Richard had watched it for weeks now, the exhaustion she carried quietly, the weight of responsibility she bore without complaint, the way she always managed to give more of herself than she had left. He knew that it wasn't just the long hours at work that drained her, it was the emotional toll, the quiet sacrifices she made every day. And yet, she never asked for help, never complained, never let on that she was struggling. He admired her strength, her resilience, but it also made him ache with a quiet sadness. This morning, as he watched her sleep, he wanted to do something simple, something small but meaningful, to show her how much he appreciated her. Richard carefully set to work, his movements precise and tender, as though the very act of preparing the meal was a quiet promise to her, a gesture of his love and gratitude. He cracked the eggs into the pan, the sizzle of them filling the otherwise silent space. The smell of fresh toast soon joined it, mingling with the earthy scent of brewing coffee. Each movement was deliberate, the care he took in preparing everything something he hoped she would feel when she woke. He wanted her to know that he saw her, saw all the little things she did, the sacrifices she made, and that she wasn't invisible to him. After a few minutes, he had everything ready: 2 eggs, sunny side up, with lightly buttered toast and a steaming mug of coffee. He arranged the food carefully on a tray, the delicate balance of the meal feeling like the perfect metaphor for the tenderness he felt toward her. His heart swelled with a quiet affection as he looked at the tray, as though it symbolized not just a simple breakfast, but the gratitude and love he carried for her every day. Moving silently, he placed the tray on the small table beside the couch, taking care not to disturb her. He studied her for a moment, her face soft in sleep, the tension in her brow momentarily absent, and he felt a pang of tenderness. He wanted to wake her, to tell her how much she meant to him, to show her that she didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. But instead, he simply stood there, watching her rest, his gaze full of love. He knew she would wake soon enough, and when she did, the first thing she would see would be the small gesture he had made for her. It wasn't much, not compared to the things she did for him and for others, but it was his way of telling her that she mattered, that he noticed the things she did, that her hard work and dedication hadn't gone unnoticed. He wasn't a man of grand gestures or sweeping declarations. Richard wasn't the type to offer words that could never quite capture the depth of his feelings. But he believed that sometimes, the simplest acts were the most meaningful, that love could be expressed not in what was said, but in what was done. As he watched her sleep, Richard felt a quiet peace settle over him. He didn't need her to say anything in return, he didn't need her to even notice the meal immediately. It was enough to know that he had shown her, in the most unassuming way, how much he cared. The time passed slowly, the minutes stretching as Richard stayed by her side, content simply in the act of giving. Finally, after what felt like hours, Sophia stirred, her eyes fluttering open as she slowly came to, the morning light still soft around her. For a brief moment, she looked confused, as though she couldn't quite understand where she was or what was happening. Then her eyes shifted to the table beside her, and when she saw the tray, her expression softened. She sat up slowly, still half asleep, but there was a faint smile on her lips as she looked over at Richard, her eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and warmth. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly, her voice still thick with sleep. But there was no reproach in her words, only a quiet acknowledgement of the care he had shown her. Richard smiled gently, his heart light. "I know," he replied simply. "I just wanted to." And for a moment, neither of them said anything else. There was no need for words to fill the silence, the simple act of placing the tray before her spoke everything that needed to be said. It was a small gesture, one that didn't require a grand explanation or a long conversation. But in that moment, as Sophia reached for the cup of coffee and took in the warmth of the meal, she understood. She understood that love wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, simple, and tender. And sometimes, it was a tray of eggs, toast, and coffee placed carefully beside you while you slept, a silent reminder that someone sees you, cares for you, and is grateful for everything you do. Sophia woke slowly, the soft morning light creeping through the curtains, casting a gentle glow over the room. As her eyes fluttered open, she noticed something unusual, a carefully arranged breakfast tray placed neatly on the bed beside her. The smell of fresh coffee and warm toast filled the air, and for a moment, she simply stared, unsure of what to make of the sight. Her mind was still clouded with the remnants of sleep, but then, as the fog cleared, a realization slowly dawned on her. The breakfast tray wasn't just any ordinary gesture, it was his gesture. Richard, the CEO of the company where she worked, the man she had seen only in passing and always from a distance, had made sure she was taken care of. He had taken time out of his undoubtedly packed schedule to prepare something for her. For her. This simple act of kindness, so thoughtful and so unexpected, made her heart swell with emotions she hadn't anticipated. At first, she felt a flicker of disbelief. Richard, the man who seemed so distant, so focused on his work, the man whose presence at the office was more of a shadow than a person, had done something so personal, so human. She had always admired him from afar, respected his dedication and leadership, but never once had she imagined that he would care enough to think of her beyond her role as an assistant. Yet here it was, a small but meaningful gesture that broke through the walls of professional distance and made her feel seen in a way she never had before. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the note tucked under the edge of the tray. It was simple, handwritten in Richard's neat, precise handwriting. "I hope you're feeling better today. Please take your time. You deserve this." The words were unassuming, but they were also a quiet declaration of care, a recognition of her humanity, of the toll that her work had taken on her, of the long hours and sacrifices she had made without complaint. It wasn't just the breakfast that moved her, it was the thoughtfulness behind it, the understanding that he had seen her, truly seen her, in a way that no one else had. Her breath caught in her throat as she absorbed the meaning of his gesture. Sophia wasn't the type to expect things from people, especially not from someone like Richard. She had grown accustomed to doing her job quietly, almost invisibly, making sure everything ran smoothly, rarely taking time for herself. The job had become a blur of tasks and deadlines, and the feeling of being overlooked had become a constant companion. In a world that valued efficiency and results, she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. But Richard's small, quiet act had pulled her out of that haze. He had noticed her. He had taken the time to consider her well-being, to acknowledge her as a person rather than just a cog in the corporate machine. It wasn't grand or extravagant, but in its simplicity, it held a depth of meaning that made her feel more appreciated than any words of praise ever could. As she took a sip of the coffee, the warmth of it spreading through her chest, Sophia felt something inside her shift. The gratitude she felt wasn't just for the meal, it was for the recognition, for the kindness that hadn't been asked for, but was freely given. It made her feel valued in a way she had never imagined, as though, in that moment, she was more than just an employee. She was a person, worthy of care and attention. As she looked out the window, the stillness of the morning wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace, a quiet sense of being grounded. Richard, the man who had always seemed so unreachable, so focused on the demands of his high-powered role, had managed to reach her in the simplest way possible. He had offered a small act of kindness that spoke volumes. In doing so, he had reminded her of the importance of taking care of oneself, of not letting the pressures of work and life erode the core of who she was. Sophia's mind wandered for a moment to the days before, when she had been running on autopilot, too caught up in the rush of deadlines and expectations to notice how drained she had become. But now, with this small, unexpected gesture, she was reminded of the importance of slowing down, of allowing herself moments of rest and self-care. The breakfast tray was more than just food, it was a symbol of something deeper, something that resonated within her, reminding her that kindness can heal, that even in the busiest of lives, there is room for moments of connection and consideration. As the morning unfolded, Sophia felt a new sense of clarity take root within her. The world outside may have been moving at its usual frantic pace, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. Richard's simple, thoughtful gesture had given her something priceless, the sense that she mattered, that she was more than just a name on a spreadsheet or a face in the crowd. She wasn't invisible. She was seen. And in that quiet moment, that truth meant everything. Sophia sat quietly at the small kitchen table, the soft clink of her spoon against her bowl the only sound in the early morning stillness. The first light of day filtered through the window, casting a warm, golden glow over the room, but her thoughts were far from serene. She had woken up early, as usual, to make sure everything was ready for her long day ahead, balancing the responsibilities of work, family, and the quiet, unspoken challenges she faced each day. Across the room, Richard, her boss, stood in the doorway, his eyes lingering on her as she ate. He hadn't meant to stare, he wasn't even sure why he was watching her, but something about the scene struck him deeply, unsettling him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Richard had always seen Sophia in the context of work, a dedicated and efficient employee who met deadlines, responded to emails promptly, and handled client meetings with the quiet professionalism that he had come to expect. In his eyes, she had always been just another cog in the machine, one of many employees whose role was to get things done. But now, as he watched her from across the room, a shift occurred. He saw her not as an employee, but as a woman, a person with a life beyond the office, someone who carried burdens he had never considered. The way she held herself, the subtle exhaustion in her posture as she ate her simple breakfast, the way she moved with a quiet grace even as she navigated the many invisible responsibilities that weighed on her, it all hit him in a way that felt profoundly humbling. In that moment, Richard realized how little he had truly known about Sophia, how little he had considered the sacrifices she made, day in and day out, to keep things running smoothly. She wasn't just an efficient worker, she was someone who gave parts of herself, quietly and without fanfare, for the sake of her family, her job, and the people around her. He thought about how she always showed up early, worked late, and never complained, always with a smile and a calm demeanor that belied the emotional toll it must have taken. He thought about the little things she did, remembering the birthdays of co-workers, making sure everyone had what they needed without ever asking for anything in return. Richard had never stopped to consider how much of her own life she sacrificed in the process. For the first time, he felt a deep sense of empathy that he had never experienced before. There was something in the way she ate her breakfast, the way she looked out the window for a brief moment of quiet reflection before diving into the demands of the day, that made him realize how much she had to juggle just to keep things together. It was as if, in those few moments, the layers of her life, her family, her personal struggles, her quiet resilience unfolded in front of him, revealing a depth of character he had never taken the time to see. Richard's feelings of admiration and respect for Sophia grew as he watched her, but it wasn't just the small acts of kindness or the attention to detail that had always impressed him. It was the underlying strength, the quiet fortitude that she carried with her, the ability to keep moving forward even when things were tough, even when no one was watching. He realized that in all his years of managing people, he had never once truly understood what it meant to be in their shoes. He had never understood the complexity of their lives, the emotional weight they carried, or the sacrifices they made. He had always seen people as tools, valuable, of course, but ultimately replaceable if they didn't meet the standards he had set. But now, as he stood there, observing Sophia, Richard felt the rawness of his own ignorance. He felt a new kind of respect growing within him, one that went beyond performance reviews or deadlines. It was a respect for her as a person, for everything she did inside the office and outside of it that no one ever saw. Richard began to wonder if he had been too focused on results and not enough on the people who made those results possible. He wondered how many others, like Sophia, were carrying invisible burdens, quietly keeping the world turning while everyone else remained unaware. It was a humbling realization, one that made him question his approach to leadership, and perhaps even the way he viewed people in general. He hadn't meant to look at Sophia with new eyes, but something in that quiet morning moment, her simple breakfast, her moment of solitude before the world demanded her attention, had opened his heart in a way he couldn't ignore. As the moments stretched on, Richard made a silent vow to himself that things would be different going forward. He couldn't undo the past or change the way he had treated his employees before, but he could try to be more aware, more mindful, more empathetic. He could take the time to see the people around him, not just as workers but as whole, complex human beings with lives and stories and struggles that were just as real as his own. That day, as he walked into the office and began his usual rounds, he looked at his employees with new eyes. He didn't see them as tools to accomplish a task, he saw them as people who, just like him, carried their own battles, their own burdens, and their own dreams. And for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to respect them, not just for their work, but for who they were, and for the sacrifices they made every single day. It was a new kind of respect, one that came not from performance metrics or achievements, but from a deeper understanding of the humanity in everyone around him. The morning light filtered gently through the kitchen window, casting soft shadows on the worn wooden table where Sophia and Richard sat, their breakfast a quiet, shared moment between them. Richard hadn't expected the silence to feel so comfortable, so natural, but as he watched Sophia carefully spread butter on her toast, he realized how much he enjoyed these simple mornings with her. There was something about the way she carried herself, always steady, always calm, even when the world seemed to demand more than she could give. But today, something was different. As Richard poured another cup of coffee, he noticed a tension in the set of Sophia's shoulders, a weariness in her eyes that wasn't there the day before. The familiar ease of their morning routine seemed to be interrupted by something unspoken, and Richard, unable to ignore the change, quietly placed his cup down and leaned forward. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice soft, the question more of a gentle invitation than an interrogation. Sophia hesitated for a moment, her hands pausing mid-motion before she placed the butter knife down and met his gaze. There was a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, a brief crack in the walls she had so carefully built around herself. "I don't know," she said, her voice quiet, almost tentative. "I've been struggling a bit lately." Richard waited, giving her the space she needed, not pushing, not rushing her words. Sophia took a deep breath, and then, slowly, she began to open up. She told him about the long hours she worked at 2 different jobs just to keep up with bills and rent, how the fatigue had begun to feel like an endless weight on her shoulders, how the constant pressure to make ends meet left little room for anything else. There were days when the exhaustion was so overwhelming she could barely find the energy to smile, much less engage in the things she once loved. And yet, she said, she kept going, because what other choice did she have? There was a quiet sadness in her words, a resignation that Richard had never fully understood until now. As she spoke, Richard felt something stir within him, an unexpected wave of empathy and admiration for the woman sitting across from him. He had always known she was strong, but hearing the depth of her struggle, the daily battles she faced in silence, made him see her in a new light. He had never really asked her about her life beyond their conversations, beyond their time together in these fleeting moments. Yet now, as she shared these pieces of herself, Richard realized that he had been blind to the weight she carried. He had thought of her as a quiet, independent woman, someone who seemed to handle everything with ease, but he hadn't realized how much she had been sacrificing just to keep moving forward. In that moment, Richard felt a deeper connection to Sophia than he had ever felt for anyone. It wasn't the usual attraction, the excitement of a new relationship, but something quieter, more profound, a recognition of her strength and resilience, a feeling that he could be a safe space for her, just as she had been for him in the past. He listened intently, his gaze never leaving hers, not out of obligation but out of genuine care and understanding. "I had no idea," he said softly when she finished speaking, the words lingering in the air between them. "I admire how much you're doing, how much you give, even when it feels like you have nothing left to give." Sophia looked down at her hands, a faint blush creeping up her neck. "It's not always easy," she said quietly, "but I don't really have a choice. I have to keep going, no matter how tired I get." Richard felt a pang in his chest at the weight of her words. He realized just how much she had been holding in, how much she had been carrying on her own without ever asking for help or showing signs of weakness. He reached across the table, his hand gently covering hers, a simple gesture of solidarity. "You don't have to do it alone, you know," he said, his voice steady, but his heart was pounding with the rawness of the moment. "I'm here. And I want to be there for you no matter what." Sophia's eyes met his again, and for a brief moment, the walls she had built seemed to crumble just enough for her to let him in. She didn't speak, but the gratitude in her gaze was enough, and Richard could see the flicker of something new, something tentative, but growing. A sense of trust. A sense of possibility. As they sat together, the quiet of the morning now filled with a different kind of warmth, Richard realized that the connection they had was more than just shared moments. It was built on understanding, vulnerability, and the willingness to be present for each other, even in the hardest times. And in that moment, over breakfast, as the world outside carried on with its demands, Richard knew that whatever came next, they were no longer just two people passing through life. They were partners, each offering something that the other needed, and in their quiet, everyday moments, they were beginning to build something stronger than either of them had imagined. For years, Richard had lived a life insulated from the struggles of those around him, his wealth and status acting as a buffer between himself and the world he thought he understood. He had always prided himself on his success, on the empire he had built through sheer determination and hard work. In his mind, he had earned every luxury, every comfort, and every achievement. But everything changed the day he met Sophia. She wasn't rich, she didn't have a title or an impressive resume, but her story, her quiet, unassuming story, began to unravel the walls Richard had carefully constructed around himself. Sophia worked for him in one of the many departments of his company, but she was different from the others. She had a presence that transcended her job description, a quiet dignity in the way she moved through her workday, a humility in her actions. When Richard first noticed her, it was just another passing glance, just another employee among hundreds. But one afternoon, during an impromptu meeting to discuss a project that had been underperforming, Sophia shared something that would forever change the way Richard saw the world. She spoke not of her own life, but of the struggles of the people she worked with, the janitors, the secretaries, the delivery drivers, the people who were often invisible to the higher UPS, including Richard himself. She spoke with an authenticity that made Richard listen closely, her words filled with honesty and a kind of sadness that he had never considered before. As she spoke, she revealed the harsh realities many employees faced, the long hours, the low wages, the lack of appreciation for their hard work. She spoke of her own sacrifices, the way she balanced her job with caring for her ailing mother, and the constant fear of losing her job in a world where security seemed like a distant dream. Richard had always assumed that everyone around him had what they needed, that his company's wealth trickled down in ways that made life easier for all involved. But Sophia's words broke through the comfortable ignorance he had lived in for so long. Her story, filled with quiet struggles and sacrifices, hit him in a way that nothing else ever had. For the first time, Richard realized just how little he had done to understand the lives of the people who made his success possible. He had taken for granted the luxury of not worrying about bills, of never fearing for his job, of having his hard work rewarded in ways that most could only dream of. Sophia had not asked for sympathy or help, but in her honest reflection, Richard saw the vast gap between his life and theirs. He realized that he had never truly seen the people who worked for him. He had never thought about the daily challenges they faced, the personal sacrifices they made just to keep their heads above water. He had never considered how his decisions, his company's policies, or even his indifference might be impacting their lives. Richard's perspective began to shift that day, but it wasn't an immediate transformation. At first, it was a quiet discomfort, a nagging feeling in the back of his mind every time he walked through the halls of his company, every time he sat in meetings with his top executives. He began to notice the tired eyes of the employees who worked long hours for low pay, the exhausted faces of people who had given their best to a system that didn't seem to value them. His once unquestioned belief in the fairness of his success began to crumble, replaced by a deep sense of guilt and responsibility. Over the following weeks, Richard started paying closer attention to the lives of those around him, particularly the people who worked on the ground level. He began talking to employees in the hallways, in the break rooms, even in the parking lot. He asked them about their struggles, their dreams, their lives outside of work, and the more he listened, the more he realized just how much he had taken for granted. He heard about mothers working 2 jobs to make ends meet, fathers sacrificing their own comfort to provide for their children, young people with dreams of education but no resources to make them a reality. The more Richard learned, the more he felt a sense of urgency to change the way he operated, not just as a businessman, but as a human being. He began to push for changes within his company, advocating for better wages, more flexible hours, and programs that would support employees in their personal lives. He introduced initiatives to give back to the communities where his company operated, creating scholarship funds, offering free child care, and providing health care benefits to all employees, not just the executives. But more than anything, Richard began to shift his mindset. He no longer saw his employees as cogs in a machine designed to fuel his success, he saw them as people whose lives were just as valuable as his own. He realized that his wealth and privilege came with a responsibility to use his resources and his position to make the world a better place, to help those who had helped him without ever asking for anything in return. His relationship with Sophia deepened, not because of any romantic interest, but because of the respect he had for her. She had unknowingly opened his eyes to the truth about himself and the world he inhabited. She had shown him the power of small acts of kindness, of speaking up for those who had no voice, and of living with integrity. Richard's journey wasn't about becoming a different person, it was about realizing the power of perspective, of understanding the struggles of others, and of recognizing the true value of the people who had always been there, quietly supporting him, often at their own expense. He wasn't perfect, and the road ahead was long, but Richard had taken the first step toward changing not just his business, but his life, all because of the quiet, powerful story of one woman who had the courage to speak her truth. For months, Sophia had kept her distance, wary of Richard's kindness, not fully understanding why someone like him would take an interest in someone like her. She had spent years building walls around her heart, walls constructed from past hurts and disappointments that told her she wasn't worthy of genuine affection, that any kindness was just a fleeting gesture. Richard, with his wealth and success, had always seemed like a person from another world, untouchable, immune to the struggles that weighed down people like her. She had hesitated, wondering if his gestures of kindness were just acts of charity, or worse, a way for him to alleviate his own guilt, to fill a void in his life that had nothing to do with her. But as time passed, as Richard showed up day after day with a sincerity that couldn't be faked, something inside Sophia began to shift. Slowly, carefully, she allowed herself to accept the small gestures he offered, the thoughtful words, the quiet support, and for the first time in a long while, she began to feel something new: peace. Richard never pushed for anything from her, he simply showed up, listened when she spoke, and gave without expecting anything in return. It was as though he saw her not as a project to fix, not as someone to be rescued, but as someone simply worthy of kindness. And as she opened herself up to him, piece by piece, she found herself letting go of the old narratives that had defined her, the ones that told her she wasn't deserving of love, of care, of human connection. It wasn't easy, but with every shared moment, every quiet evening spent talking or sitting in silence, she felt the walls around her heart crumble, bit by bit. One evening, after a long day of work, Richard brought her a cup of tea, just as he always did, and they sat together in the comfortable silence that had become a part of their routine. This time, as she sipped the warm drink, a deep sense of gratitude washed over her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, as though Richard had unknowingly lightened the load simply by being there, by accepting her as she was, without judgment or expectation. Sophia felt valued not for anything she could give, not for the things she had accomplished or the way she looked, but for the person she truly was. She realized that Richard had never seen her as a charity case, never viewed her struggles as something to pity. Instead, he saw the strength in her, the resilience that had carried her through years of hardship, and he respected that. The peace she felt was profound, a quiet balm for wounds she hadn't even realized were still there. Richard, too, felt the subtle but powerful shift in their connection. Despite his wealth and the many accolades he had earned, he had always felt a deep sense of loneliness, a distance from those around him. His success had come at a steep price, relationships had been fleeting, and the people who entered his life often seemed to be there for the wrong reasons. His wealth, which he once thought would bring him everything he desired, had only created a wall between him and others, a barrier that kept genuine human connection at bay. He had always longed for someone who could see him for who he truly was, beyond the numbers on his bank account, someone who didn't want anything from him but simply valued his presence. And in Sophia, he found that rare, authentic connection. It wasn't that she didn't know who he was or what he had, but she didn't seem to care. She never treated him differently because of his wealth, instead, she treated him with the same honesty and vulnerability that she had shown to no one else. Her openness made him feel seen in a way he hadn't in years. And as he witnessed her begin to heal, to let go of the weight of her past, he found himself healing too, in ways he hadn't expected. The loneliness that had plagued him for so long began to fade, replaced by a sense of belonging that came from being seen for who he truly was, not for his status or his achievements. For the first time, Richard felt that he wasn't alone, that someone cared for him not because of what he could offer, but simply because of who he was. Their shared journey toward healing became a quiet, shared understanding. As they spent more time together, their bond grew not out of obligation, but out of mutual respect and genuine affection. Both had experienced the isolation of their own worlds, Sophia's coming from years of self-doubt, and Richard's from the loneliness that success had brought him, but together, they had found a kind of peace that neither had thought possible. They no longer sought validation from external sources, but instead found it in each other, in the quiet moments of understanding, in the unspoken reassurance that they were enough, just as they were. In the end, It wasn't Richard's wealth or Sophia's past that defined their connection, it was the gratitude and healing they shared, a quiet recognition that sometimes the greatest gifts we can give each other are not grand gestures, but simply being present, being real, and allowing each other to heal in the light of unconditional acceptance. Sophia had always seen herself as little more than a maid in Richard's world, a woman who cleaned his house, organized his life, and remained mostly invisible in the background of his days. Richard, a man whose life had been shaped by success and isolation, had always kept his emotions hidden behind a facade of professionalism and control. To him, Sophia was an employee no more, no less, whose purpose was to keep his home in order while he focused on the work that defined his existence. But their relationship, built on routine and unspoken boundaries, began to change in a way neither of them expected, and it started with something as simple as a quiet act of kindness. It was on a particularly long and draining day that Sophia noticed Richard sitting alone in his study, his face buried in his hands, the weight of exhaustion and something more pressing bearing down on him. For the first time, she saw him not as the employer who signed her paycheck, but as a person, a man burdened by more than his work. Without thinking, she placed a cup of tea on his desk and quietly asked if he needed anything. Richard, surprised by her presence, looked up at her with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. He hadn't expected to be seen, to be treated with such gentle care. He was used to running on his own, to managing everything, including his emotions. Yet there was something in Sophia's eyes, something so simple and kind that broke through the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself. From that day, things began to shift. Sophia continued her work as usual, but their interactions became different. She began to notice the subtle cracks in Richard's carefully built exterior, the way he flinched when he received yet another call from his estranged family, the way his hands trembled when he glanced at old photos of his late wife, the sadness that seemed to cloud his every decision. Slowly, Richard began to realize that Sophia wasn't just a maid, she was someone who, despite her quiet nature, seemed to understand things that no one else did. She noticed the smallest details, the heaviness in his voice, the exhaustion in his eyes, and it comforted him. Over time, they began to talk in a way that went beyond the usual exchanges of pleasantries or work-related matters. They spoke of their lives, their struggles, their pasts. Sophia shared that she, too, had faced hardships, that she had left behind her own dreams and ambitions to care for a family that no longer appreciated her. Richard, in turn, spoke of the loneliness he had carried since losing his wife, of how success had come at the cost of meaningful connections, and of how he had convinced himself that he didn't need anyone else. The more they talked, the more their relationship shifted from one of employer and employee to something deeper, a mutual understanding born out of shared vulnerability. Sophia began to see Richard not as the aloof, distant man who paid her wages, but as someone whose pain mirrored her own. Richard, in turn, began to see Sophia as more than the woman who cleaned his house. She became a presence in his life, a reminder that there was still kindness in the world, even in the most unexpected places. With each passing day, the bond between them grew stronger, founded on the simple acts of kindness and understanding that seemed so small at first but were, in reality, life-changing. They had both been locked in their own worlds of pain, self-doubt, and isolation, but together they began to heal. Sophia no longer felt invisible, and Richard no longer felt the weight of his emotions alone. They began to share moments outside of the constraints of their professional roles, taking walks together, sharing meals, and offering each other the comfort of quiet companionship. For the first time in years, Richard found himself looking forward to his time with Sophia, not because of her duties, but because of the connection they shared. And Sophia, who had once viewed her role as a maid as something temporary, began to see her place in Richard's life as something more lasting, a true partnership. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset in silence, Richard turned to Sophia and, for the first time, offered her a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes and softened the harsh lines of his face. He looked at her not as his employee, but as someone who had changed his life. "I never thought I needed anyone," he said quietly. "But I was wrong. I need you, Sophia. And I want you to know that I'll be here for you, too. Not just as your employer, but as someone who sees you, who values you, and who wants to build something meaningful with you." The words hung in the air between them, and in that moment, Sophia realized that what had begun as an act of kindness had blossomed into something neither of them had expected: love, mutual respect, and the promise of a new beginning. No longer confined by the boundaries of their previous roles, they both began to envision a future together, one in which they could heal, grow, and thrive side by side. It was a future that was no longer defined by past pain or professional obligation, but by the simple, profound truth that sometimes the most unexpected connections can lead to the most beautiful transformations. Together, they embarked on a new journey, one that would change their lives forever, built on the foundation of understanding, kindness, and a love that neither of them had ever expected, but both of them desperately needed.